I'm Winnie Dunn. I'm professor and chair at the University of Kansas Department of Occupational Therapy Education. This podcast is about situating sensory processing concepts with other sensory concepts. How do they compare to each other? So when we compare the two approaches, sensory integration and sensory processing, we see that there is a difference in the emphasis of each approach. With a sensory integration approach, the emphasis is on engaging in therapeutic activities to change the child's skills and abilities so that the child can participate. Interventions focus on remediating the underlying sensory difficulty. The idea here is that when we change the sensory processing of the person, we then make it possible for them to participate. In sensory processing approaches, the emphasis is on adjusting the context and the activity features to support the child's participation based on what their sensory needs might be. From this perspective, attention is not directed towards the sensory differences, but rather we consider the person's performance and participation in the context of activities and environments. We make it possible for a child to participate by making adjustments in activities and environments based on the child's sensory pattern. First, we will use the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework from 2014, which is the third edition of this document, to show the different emphasis in sensory processing and sensory integration. Although everyone considers all of these aspects, different approaches emphasize different aspects of this framework. In a sensory integration approach, which you see in gold on the slide, the emphasis is on client factors and performance skills in the occupational therapy process. In this approach, the therapy assessment and intervention processes focus predominantly on body functions, perceptual and motor skills, cognitive and emotional regulation. When using a sensory integration approach, knowledge about a person's sensory patterns forms the basis for designing interventions to change performance skills and client factors. In a sensory processing approach, the focus is primarily on activity demands and context and environment, which are illustrated in green. There is a strong consideration of social, space, and timing demands, required body and object actions, and the features of the context. When using a sensory processing approach, knowledge about a person's sensory processing is used to consider how aspects of activity demands and context might be supporting or interfering with participation in everyday occupations. The Occupational Therapy Practice Framework also describes intervention approaches and links the intervention approaches with aspects of the occupational therapy domains illustrated in the previous slide. The create, promote, maintain, and prevent intervention approaches are linked with all aspects of occupational therapy domains. This means that when we are engaging in these interventions, we can be focusing on any of the domains listed in the prior slide. The Establish Restore intervention is designed to change the person's skills or abilities. The sensory integration approach is most likely to emphasize this intervention because sensory integration focuses on the changing skills and functions of the sensory mechanisms so the person can develop more adaptive behaviors. The person's sensory processing patterns form the basis for designing interventions to improve the underlying sensory functions so that the person can respond more successfully in everyday life. For example, the child maneuvers through an obstacle course to improve balance and praxis. The Modify intervention is designed to adjust the activity demands and contextual features to support participation in everyday life. The sensory processing approach is most likely to emphasize this intervention because sensory processing focuses on creating successful participation. The person's sensory processing patterns serve as a guide for addressing activity and context adjustments to create a more friendly way for the person to be successful as they engage in everyday life. For example, providing earphones during seat work to reduce the impact of a classroom noise so the child can concentrate and complete his work. The CanChild Center for Childhood Disability Research publishes evidence briefs entitled Keeping Current. They provide a summary review of sensory integration research, which was last updated in 2009 by Nancy Pollock. In this document, they discuss classical sensory integration therapy. Parham and Malo describe this intervention as therapy that aims to provide the child with graded sensory experiences that elicit the just right challenge to produce an adaptive response. The therapist and child interact in an active way using special equipment that provides intense sensory experiences. The CanChild report indicates that studies in the 1970s suggest that SI therapy was promising, but that analysis of more recent and better designed studies showed there was not much difference in the SI therapy groups when compared to other intervention options and when compared to no treatment at all. In more recent studies using descriptive, case report, interview, or research review formats, scholars have indicated that SI techniques can lead to behavioral changes. Quasi-experimental studies have also shown positive changes. However, with the limitations of these designs, people still feel we must remain cautious about stating efficacy. In summarizing, Pollock states, the decision to provide sensory integration therapy should be carefully considered. SIT is a resource-intensive intervention, and the time and resources devoted to this therapy mean that the child is not receiving another type of intervention during that time. Without solid evidence that SIT is more effective than alternative therapies, it is difficult to support its usage." End quote. Let's look at other reports from this same time period to see what they have to say. Also in 2009, the American Academy of Pediatrics published a paper from Complementary and Holistic and Integrative Medicine subsection of their professional society entitled Sensory Integration. Among the comments in their paper, they had the following statements to summarize their findings, and I'm quoting. SI therapy is a popular treatment for multiple conditions, but strong empiric evidence in a standard case control format does not yet support its efficacy. And sensory integration is the most widely studied treatment in occupational therapy. At present, SI therapy should be considered a potential adjunctive treatment, but not at the expense of evidence-based therapies or needed instruction at school. And then in 2012, the journal Pediatrics published an article entitled Sensory Integration Therapies for Children with Developmental and Behavioral Disorders. In this article, they made the following recommendations to pediatricians. Number 1, do not use sensory processing disorder as a diagnosis. Number 2, communicate with families regarding limited data on sensory-based therapies. Number 3, teach families how to determine whether a therapy is effective by designing simple ways to monitor the effects, by focusing on improving the child's ability to engage in participation in everyday activities, and to set a limit and discuss whether the therapy is working to achieve the stated goals. And finally, the family, pediatrician, and other clinicians must collaborate to prioritize treatment based on the effects of sensory problems on a child's ability to perform daily functions of childhood. And in 2015, the College of Occupational Therapists in London created a practice briefing to summarize the knowledge to date on sensory integration. They acknowledge that some authors have proposed using the term sensory processing disorder, and they agree with the American Academy of Pediatrics that SPD should not be used as a diagnosis by occupational therapists. In 2015, the College of Occupational Therapists in London created a practice briefing where they described several aspects of discerning sensory integration and other approaches. They described the proper way to evaluate sensory factors as, first, part of comprehensive assessment to look at body functions, perceptual acts, as an environmental feature, as a characteristic of an activity, and as a characteristic of tools and materials that children might use. They also state that findings must be situated within the person's everyday life activities and demands, and that goals must focus on participation rather than sensory features. Appropriate activities and contexts are important in this process, not changing the sensory characteristics of the child. The College of Occupational Therapists also summarized 2 categories for intervention approaches related to sensory features of behavior. The first category they refer to as impairment-oriented approaches, and they include AIRS sensory integration and sensory-based interventions under this category. AIRS sensory integration is a person-focused intervention which addresses a person's sensory needs in therapy. The aim of therapy is to change the way the body processes sensory input, leading to more adaptive behaviors. They report that the research is inconclusive about the effectiveness of AIRS sensory integration. First, many studies that are called AIRS sensory integration do not meet the fidelity criteria set out in the literature. They refer to 5 studies since 2000 which show some positive effects. The other study did not meet the criteria for AIRS sensory integration and so confused the landscape. Sensory-based interventions are not led by the person, and so they do not adhere to the AIRS sensory integration protocol. Sensory-based interventions are not functional and are frequently carried out by caregivers other than the therapist. The hypothesis is that by using sensory stimulation, it promotes changes in arousal, which in turn change the nervous system, as a child could use sensory information then more effectively. There is limited evidence that these strategies are effective. The second category is performance-based oriented approaches, and the intention of these approaches is to manage the person's situation rather than to change their sensory processing. Interdisciplinary evidence supports this approach. For example, a social story, which is an evidence-based practice in education, can involve the child's sensory processing needs, creating an opportunity to change the activity the next time to support the child's particular participation needs. The College of Occupational Therapists conclude with key recommendations that are listed here on the slide. Be clear in documentation, including rationale and evidence for interventions we select. Share evidence with families and teachers. Consider sensory factors in the context of participation. Clearly relate goals to participation and regularly review them related to participation. And evaluate effectiveness in context with every child. So let's look at one activity from 2 different points of view. On this slide, we see what a sensory integration approach might look like in a therapeutic swinging activity. On the slide, we see some of the key points that a person with a sensory integration approach would consider. That this activity activates the vestibular and proprioceptive systems, that it engages the vestibulo-ocular coordination, it supports playfulness, and it triggers praxis. As summarized earlier in the College of Occupational Therapists briefing from London, they recommend caution if using these modalities and suggest that therapists have a clear rationale for their use of sensory-based interventions and make them time limited so that goals can clearly be set. Now let's look at therapeutic swinging from a performance-oriented approach. From this standpoint, therapists are embedding sensory processing patterns of the child into the routines of the everyday life. They are supporting families to do the activities of their interests, supporting teachers to get school-related behaviors accomplished, and therefore are building the capacity of the providers to support the child in everyday life. This approach also enhances child development and produces parental competence along the way. The College of Occupational Therapists in London state that particularly occupational therapists are skilled in providing interventions in this category. This approach is consistent with core values of OT and the intersection of the person, environment, and activities, as in the occupational therapy framework. So in summary, we have a responsibility to situate our therapeutic interventions within the context of children's everyday lives, no matter what our discipline is. We have a responsibility to provide evidence and a rationale for our therapeutic choices. And we have a responsibility to document progress systematically and to change our approaches when participation is not changing. This particular podcast was about sensory integration and sensory processing. I hope you understand the differences now from various points of view and have better ideas about how to make decisions on your team. Thanks for listening.